Welcome to Satsang Conversations, where we journey across the world to the serene and sacred spaces of BAPS Mandirs. This podcast is your gateway to exploring profound spiritual lessons that echo through time, yet remain incredibly relevant to our everyday lives. Each episode brings heartfelt discussions, wisdom, and insights that help us navigate the challenges of modern life with a deeper sense of peace, purpose, and connection. So whether you're seeking inspiration, solace, or a spark to light up your spiritual path, join us as we dive into conversations that uplift the soul and enrich the heart. This week, we travel to Stafford, Texas, to the BAPS Mandir in Houston, where we'll be joining in a conversation with Swami Bhaktivardhandas.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Jai Swaminarayan. Today, we're going to talk about a Vachanamrut, do Goshti on the Vachanamrut. And that Vachanamrut is Gadhada Section 1, number 16. So, Parth, please go ahead and tell us a little bit about this Vachanamrut. And as you read along, we'll discuss some of the points that come up.
So this is actually Yogiji Maharaj is one of his Ang Vachanamrut. He talked about how if we can personalize this to ourselves. So I'll start reading. On Maksar Vadi 4, Samvat 1876, December 5th, 1819, Shriji Maharaj was sitting in Dada Kachar's darbar in Gadhada. He was dressed entirely in white clothes. At that time, an assembly of sadhus, as well as devotees from various places, had gathered before him.
Right, it's interesting about this Vachanamrut is you mentioned that is one of Yogi Bapa's Angnu Vachanamruts and ones that we should personalize. But often Sashriji Maharaj would have Yogi Bapa read this Vachanamrut afternoon, but then he would do Nirupan on it for 3 hours. You know, if looking at the Vachanamrut just now, it's 3 paragraphs if you count the introduction. But to spend 3 hours talking about this is just, you know, it's something that we'll have to see what Maharaj talks about in this Vachanamrut.
Thereupon Shriji Maharaj said, a wise devotee of God who can discern between Sat and Asat identifies the flaws within himself and thoughtfully eradicates them.
So the devotee who has the ability to discern between Sat and Asat, and that person is said to have, I think the title probably has the word wisdom. And in Gujarati, the word that they use is Vivek. To translate it really directly, it's that word that we're talking about, being able to discern or to sort of discriminate or distinctly identify between Sat and Asat. And I think you mentioned the first quality of someone like that. And that quality of someone who has this ability is to be able to identify your own flaws and then thoughtfully eradicate them. So what do you guys think about this first characteristic?
I think it's an interesting sort of word choice too, that it's not attempts to eradicate or in the process of eradicating. It's a 2-step process. One, you identify that you have flaws, which is really hard for, I think, all of us to do, or for myself. And then the second thing is that he eradicates. So maybe it's a mindset that, yeah, it's going to be gone no matter what. And I think that's interesting word choice when I hear that.
Yeah, I agree. I think in that first step, just being able to identify is something that you can't really take for granted. Maharaj talks about what moh is, or what delusion is. And he says very clearly that delusion is when you cannot identify your own flaws. And so, there's a whole Vachanamrut dedicated to this idea of what delusion is. And so, the fact that it's a whole Vachanamrut means that it's quite prevalent. The lack of ability to identify your own flaws. Because I think, in most cases, we're victims of the moment, right? The circumstances help dictate our reactions. And so, we don't have the bandwidth necessarily to be able to tell that, okay, well, in this moment, really, the problem is that I need to fix this. We can't really see our flaws. So being able to identify it is a really big first step. And then Jigar just mentioned that, eradicating them, thoughtfully eradicating it. That might be an even more impressive and bigger step, to be able to think in that way, that, okay, well, I found it, because sometimes in satsang we kind of find it and then we just accept it. Well, it is what it is. I have this flaw and I don't think it's going to change much. But someone who has Vivek, or this ability to discern between Sat and Asat, that person is thoughtfully eradicating them. And I think there's the other part of what this is saying is that this person isn't like someone who's reached the pinnacle of spirituality. Because if you're in the process of eradicating your flaws, that means that you have stuff to work on. So that's interesting that, even Maharaj is saying that if you have this ability, then you might not necessarily be at the pinnacle, but this is how you function. You identify your flaws and you thoughtfully work to eradicate them.
But I think like even the concept of identifying, like I'm still stuck on the first portion, is that there's still a kami, like a deficiency in a lot of us, that I think we sometimes try to blame the external circumstances, like, oh, this person did this to me and that's why I wasn't able to do that. So you find every other fault, like you find a fault in everything else except blaming yourself or finding the flaw internally, you find it externally. And that, I think that's hard enough. And then there's the second step too. So maybe I'd love to understand, like, how do you see the first step? How do we focus internally rather than externally?
I think Maharaj makes a correlation between this ability, right? Right now, we're just at that correlation that if you have this ability, this is one way that it manifests itself. That you have this tendency to understand what's sat and what's asat. As in, what are the things that you can really rely upon, that are dependable, that have, a long shelf life, quote unquote. But to be, more technical spiritually, what are the things that are eternally true or present versus what is perishable? So that idea probably means that this person is much more thoughtful and mindful, so that they're not as reactionary, right? And I think what happens is, why do we lose that ability, or why do we not cultivate that ability? Because when something happens, right, what's the easiest way for us to get out of that uncomfortable situation? It'll be to blame something else or someone else. It's to kind of feel better about who we are, because our mistake or our position is justified. It's not comfortable to confront your flaws when you think about them in a certain way. Like we feel like it's like a judgment of who we are. And for people who have that ability to distinguish between Sat and Asat, I think one characteristic is that they develop this courage or this resilience. And that resilience, the other side of it is that they don't fear judgment, because they recognize that, okay, whatever I am right now, if I know what's the problem, then I can correct it. I think in our katha, we often hear this example that, okay, there's a snake in the house. Would you be glad to know that there's a snake in the house? Or do you just want to say, oh, there's no snake, just because snakes are scary? It's better to know, because then you can actually get rid of it. And I think that's what makes people feel good about knowing their flaws. When they know, they have the confidence that, okay, it's there, but there's a process for me to remove them. So it's not like a final judgment about me.
So with that analogy, I think it's interesting is I think we don't focus on, hey, I want to know if there's a snake in the house or not. It's that, oh, who left the door open to let the snake in the house? And I think we have that victim mindset more so than say, hey, let me own up that this is a deficiency that I have and I want to then eradicate it. That's the way I also see it, is like, maybe it's like someone who has Vivek versus someone who has a victim mentality and tries to blame every other thing other than themselves.
I think the idea of like what Maharaj subtly mentions here is that idea of like doing antardrashti on a regular basis, right? Looking inwards. And often I think when you develop a practice of it, like obviously I think for me, even it's something that I struggle with to do it regularly. But those that I've spoken to that do a little bit of antardrashti, that even journal a little bit, which is like an idea of doing introspection in a way, they find a way to stop playing that victim card and starting to look within. So I think it is a process that if you wake up tomorrow and be like, okay, I'm only going to look within now, it's not going to happen that way. And I think that's natural. But I think that idea of like slowly doing it, over time, you'll start playing less of that victim card and actually saying, okay, maybe it was, forget about that who left the door open, but what if, how do I attack that snake now? Or how do I work on getting that out of my house? And I think that's the subtle point that Maharaj makes in this point, that you have to first address that you even have the problem. You can't start blaming other people. But we have a lack of antardrashti in our lives that really puts us in a...
Well, yeah, the natural question is, why can't I blame other people? And what seems to be the answer to that is that you can't, like, you have to stay within your circle of control, right? Or your most, if you have the greatest effect when you stay within your circle of control. There's some things that we can't control. Like if I'm going to complain about stuff that I have no influence over, then I waste energy and effort and intellect on things that I have no control over. And so I think that's the idea of focusing on your flaws, that now you've focused all of your energy and ability on the one thing that you have control over. You can't control if someone else or something else is going to behave or act in a certain way. And where you can, you can sort of think about that. But I think the idea is to, okay, let's get the most out of your ability. And to get the most out of your ability, just focus on the things that you can control.
Yeah, and Swami says, Maharaj says here, right, can discern. And then on top of that, he says, thoughtfully, right, eradicate. So it's like you're putting the effort in. Knowing, one is knowing, and then putting the effort in, because you can't do the second part without knowing the first part. And then Maharaj says, he also rejects any apparent flaws he perceives in the sant or a satsangi, and imbibes only their virtues.
I think, we see people in satsang like this that it feels like they're very innocent. Yogiji Maharaj, he had this tendency that, no matter how simple or plain or, maybe someone who had real apparent flaws, and yet Swami would say, "Ato mukta se." The guy who stole shoes, he was caught red-handed, but Yogiji Maharaj just completely denied it. He said that, "No, ato hoyaj nahi, ato mukta se." And decades later, that mumukshu at the time came to Sarangpur and he told the story. He said that Yogiji Maharaj, I still remember that he protected me and he became a satsangi. And so, it's amazing that, the great souls in our satsang have developed this ability.
Yeah, so there's 2 points. Like when I hear like the Yogi Baba prasang, I just hear that it's not in isolation. Like that prasang didn't happen in isolation. His mindset was constantly thinking positive thoughts about Hari Bhaktas, about Santos, and everything. And so he could frame an apparent negative situation in a positive way. In this Vachanamrut, it's very interesting also word choice of using apparent. Because it's not like, it's like a subtle flaw, or it's that, maybe you had to really dig deep to find it. No, it's there, and it's obvious to everyone, and you have to then reject that thought and focus on his positives.
Yeah, there's probably a training that goes into this where, when you start out trying to reject apparent flaws, because as you said, the word apparent means that you can see it. Like if someone is making a mistake right in front of your eyes, then you're not going to cover your eyes. So what do you do? And I think the idea here that Maharaj is trying to lead us towards is, all of us have narratives about the people we know. I think even without even trying, we have this sort of internal introduction. They say, in Gujarati we say parichay, kokno parichay apo. So we have that sort of internal narrative of how every person that we know is. We might define them by some certain characteristics, good or bad. And I think that's what we're meant to kind of free ourselves from by, if or what Maharaj is saying, that if you have this ability, then you're not using those negative flaws that you've seen, that you may have witnessed, that may have occurred. You're not using them to build that narrative. You control the narrative. Like if I'm going to think about a Hari Bhakta that I saw last week, then it's up to me to determine how I'm going to remember it. I'm going to remember that person for the worst thing I saw them do. Well, then that's a choice I'm making. And if I'm making that choice, then based on this, I won't have that ability, or at least I don't have that ability right now. But I think what Maharaj is trying to encourage us to do is that, okay, fix the narrative. You saw it, it happened, it's on your face. It's not that it didn't happen, but let's make some effort to put that flaw outside. Like leave it alone. Just it doesn't do anything. It doesn't help you. It doesn't build a positive image, someone that you can learn from. So work to reject the flaw and focus on the stuff that's actually going to help you in your sadhana.
So I see that like what you're saying is like what we would normally do is confirmation bias. Like anything that they do, it reinforces a negative trait that you already perceive in that Hari Bhakta, rather than saying a confirmation bias from a positive standpoint. Like, yes, this person is so humble, and it reinforces that thought. It's usually on the negative side. And to follow that up, like, why do we perceive flaws in Hari Bhakta so easily, or other people so easily compared to ourselves? Is it ego-driven response or a defense mechanism?
Even defense mechanisms, if you really, really go into what it ultimately is, Mansai Maharaj often says this, that if you see a bhav in someone else, it's nothing else except our ego and our pride. And if you're able to remove that pride at some point, then you definitely don't see that. So I guess for us, it can be a sign. It could be, okay, that I cannot reject this flaw in someone else. So that can be sort of like an internal alarm that, okay, I need to fix this, because it is a manifestation of my pride or ego. So how do I get rid of that? I just have to think, okay, eno gun sushe. And so we have that tradition. In our satsang, there's so much discussion about doing gun grahan, or seeing positive characteristics in people, in satsangis, and trying to focus on that, again, to build that narrative. Right? We all have it. And if you're going to have a narrative about somebody, then why not fill it with all of these different qualities? The tradition for us is that if the person has 99 flaws, then we should focus on just one. That's how our gurus have talked about it. That someone has 99 flaws. Well, he must have one thing. And if he has just one thing, then that's what we should focus on. And of course, that's spiritual endeavor. But it's worth it. It's worth it because, as Maharaj said, it has a real strong correlation for us to be able to have that kind of higher level wisdom.
So on that, The next line, moreover, he never perceives any faults whatsoever in God. So it's like a stepping stone, right? If you are perceiving faults in the Sant or a Satsangi, eventually that may lead you down to the path of perceiving faults into God, right? And so that's even the lines, right? How they've been organized. It's not God first, it's God second. First it's Satsangis and the Sant, and then it comes into God. So it's like that stepping stone.
It's kind of the idea of Sambandha Meba, right? Because you mentioned the example of 99 flaws and one potential positive trait or virtue, right? Is it us always associating, even because a lot of times we don't really interact with everyone to know their virtues, which is probably a flaw in itself, right? We got to do a better effort of getting to know other fellow Haribhaktas. But the idea of Sambandha Meba is interesting when it kind of popped into mind here, because that's that always fallback virtue that you can always see. But going back to the line before this, it says, Maharaj said, obviously you want to reject those flaws, but you want to imbibe their virtues. So the idea of imbibing virtues, I think we spent so much time focusing on, rejecting those flaws. How do you see us imbibing those virtues? Like, we don't always interact with them to even get to know these virtues. But like, what are your thoughts around that aspect of it? Because it's a two-part step, again, like the first line. It's rejecting their flaws, but also figuring out a way to learn from them, like be a sponge of these qualities that might be out there.
I mean, it's probably a good amount of effort that's demanded in this form. That when you see someone do something that has value, for us, we look at value in a lot of different ways. You can look at it from a more worldly perspective, so that if I'm in a certain field of study or I'm in a certain career, then I might look at someone who's advanced in that career and try to find something that they're doing that I can learn from. In satsang, most of what we're looking for is the way people do seva, the way people do bhakti, and especially when they're doing their seva and bhakti and niyam palan, they're doing it in the way that the Satpurush has prescribed. And I think a lot of us, if we focus on those areas, then it's not very hard to find inspiration. But as you said, that imbibing it is a little bit different. I think we have to have some sort of personal kind of plan for this. I think some people take niyams on their birthday. Some people will have some sort of process that they, look at. Maharaj has said that, every year we should look at how much vasana I had before and how much I have right now. So you have to be looking back. As you said, introspection, antardrashti is a habit we have to cultivate. And through that habit, the awareness is awakened. But by taking, by regularly finding virtue in other people, I think it becomes second nature for us to try to work towards those virtues. Because when you're looking for it all the time, I think it's natural to be encouraged or inspired by it. I think we end up changing the company that we keep based on that kind of idea, that if I'm looking for those virtues, I had just like a second nature to develop that, then I think it actually affects our inclinations and our interests. We start to move away from more worldly pursuits, and you start when you're regularly looking at, oh, this person follows this niyam really well, this person does ekadashi upvas really well, and then you ask them, how do you do it? And you ask Motera Santo, if you have that internal sort of process that I want to get better, then it lines up really well with looking for virtues in other people. I think it's probably, some of it is organic, but I think what has to come from us is the mumukshudha, that I want to be better. So that first line that Jigar pointed out, that this person has this idea that he's thoughtfully eradicating his flaws. So he has that tendency. And if you have that tendency, it works really well with looking for virtue wherever you can find it.
I think it's like what That's what I took away too, is that if you have that level of self-awareness, it's naturally inherent that you will then not only eradicate, but then try to imbibe like the positive qualities. It sort of like comes together.
You read that line, he never perceives flaws in Bhagwan. Now we can go back to that. And you mentioned there's a sort of progressive nature to how Maharaj talked about it, right? He started with, okay, this person always looks at their own flaws and tries to eradicate them. And next, this person rejects the flaws that are apparent flaws in others, and satsangis and sadhus. And then finally, this person never perceives flaws in Bhagwan. And I think there are some common incidents in our satsang history that point to the importance of this. In Gadhada Pratham, section 1, number 31, Maharaj talks about this challenge that happens, that when you see a flaw in another satsangi, depending on how deep that can go, it can lead very easily to perceiving flaws in Bhagwan. And the example he gives is from the Mahabharata of Shishupal, who saw these flaws in the Pandavas, and ultimately, because Krishna Bhagwan had a sort of a good relationship with the Pandavas, and he had love for them, Shishupal ended up lying and just telling mistruths about Krishna. And so in satsang we have the prasang of Buddho Dada, which is a very famous prasang where Dada Kachar's sevak was massaging his feet unknowingly, and when that happened, the reaction that he gave, realizing, oh, this is not Dada Kachar, this is just Buddho Dada, it wasn't a good reaction, and Buddha Dada didn't appreciate it. But that progressed from Dada Kachar's sevak to Dada Kachar to Muktanand Swami, and then ultimately to Maharaj. So there's a progression there, and maybe that's why Maharaj has spoken about it in this way. But to the point itself, never perceiving a flaw in Bhagwan, I think that's interesting, because when you first think about it, okay, well, do we perceive flaws in Bhagwan? And why would Maharaj mention it as a characteristic of someone who has this level of wisdom? Like when do we see flaws in Bhagwan? Or what prompts us to see flaws in Bhagwan?
I think that's tricky because it happens so innately. Like, we don't always correlate it to seeing a flaw in Bhagwan. We may see flaw in a situation or an outcome of like something that may have happened, but I think without really recognizing it, you're seeing a flaw in Bhagwan, right? The idea of sarvakartapanu isn't coming in at that point. And maybe that's one of the ways where, if a situation didn't go the way we had planned or expected based on all the tayari or the planning that was done, maybe in that situation, taking blame and every other thing, you may, unknowingly be taking a flaw in Bhagwan because everything just happened the way he wanted it to happen. That's one way I can think of it.
I think unmet expectations is interesting. Like we create expectations for a certain scenario, and when they don't play out that way, it's upsetting to us. And when you attribute that to Bhagwan, then that's when this seeing flaws comes in. But otherwise, you would think that, okay, we're devotees of Bhagwan, we're all satsangi, and we see Maharaj as our Bhagwan. We see Maharaj and we say his Jai, we sing his bhajans. But at the same time, if something happens where, Bapa gives labh to someone else, and we were supposed to get labh, and then we don't get it, do we think like, well, why does Bapa give labh to this person? Especially if it happens repeatedly. Why does he always give labh to this person? And why can't I get that kind of labh? So I think there's that we have certain things that we want personally, and when we don't get that, or those expectations are met, I think that's an immediate source for us to kind of see a flaw in what Bhagwan is doing.
I think all of that is tied into what you were saying earlier, that it's ego driven. So that is the fundamental element of like even this person. Once you're dug in so deep that regardless of whatever steps of Haribhaktos, Santos, Maharaj comes to try to help, you don't have the Vivek to discern between what is bothersome or like his ego versus something that, okay, I need to now like understand my mistake and have that awareness.
Yeah. I think, from Maharaj's time, look at all the interactions between Haribhakto and our gurus. And what we see is that when you have enough patience and enough faith, then ultimately there's a big benefit. And it's often when it doesn't work in your favor. Things don't always go in the favor of the favored Haribhakta. Someone that Maharaj loves, but it doesn't always work out for them the way, you might expect to. But when they maintain enough patience to kind of say, okay, well, Bhagwan would not do anything wrong to me. Over time, the big payoff is that they get to see the big plan. They get to see what the whole purpose of it all was, especially for them personally. And the other side is also true, that someone like Alayakacher, because you talked about how it's gonna be ego. A lot of it is going to be at that ego. And Alayakacher's example is pretty amazing because he helped the faith of so many people. Like, he convinced, as we say in Satsang, more than 2,000 people that Bhagwan Swaminarayan was indeed Bhagwan. And that's no small thing, to talk to someone, do sampark, introduce them to satsang, and then because of your interaction with them, they're inspired to take on satsang and then ultimately see Maharaj as, their Bhagwan. That's a big deal. And that's a lot of seva to have done. And then at the same time, Maharaj says a few things, and it's usually this kind of example where Muktanand Swami, Maharaj asked Muktanand Swami that, who are the great Hari Bhakto? And Muktanand Swami says a few names. And maybe Alayakacher was also on his mind, but he didn't even have the patience to wait. It was just that, okay, these names were said, what about me? And even going further along, something that Maharaj did that was playful, right? Maharaj was actually giving him love. It's something that if you write in your diary that Bhagwan Swaminarayan pranked me in the lake, it's like the most amazing thing to be able to say. If he didn't feel bad about it, what an incredible prasang that would be, that we would tell now that Alayakacher, wow, Maharaj gave him amazing love. Like, no one will get love like this. And instead, it turned out to be the exact opposite. It turned out to be his downfall. And to such an extent that, he tried to go back to those people and tell them that, oh, remember that person I told you about? Yeah, it turns out he's not Bhagwan. And so ego is, I think it's true that when it comes to, what our expectations are, and, as we say in Satsang, mandharyu, that, what I want. And that's very much about ego and, not having that ego fulfilled.
I think a lot of that is, I always try to then look at the prasang from Alayakacher's point of view. And at that moment, no matter what moment it was, he thought he was right. Like, and no one could convince him otherwise. So what made him feel like that? It's a state of some level of delusion, which is the exact opposite of what we're talking about in the Vachanamrut of having Vivek. And, that's an interesting element, because I think he doesn't believe he's wrong. And I don't know if at a later point he believes there is some temporal element there of a feeling of delusion. And that happens to all of us at different time points. And so how do you prevent that? And then be able to see what's, I guess in this case, right or wrong, or to be able to discern that, hey, I need to have this level of self-awareness to prevent putting myself in that situation?
I think it's a hard thing to do when you're in that moment, like that moment of, you're in a defensive position. And if we wait until that moment to kind of test ourselves, if I can win that moment, I think that's hard. I think it's, okay, now you've read this Vachanamrut. You've been given this awareness. Yogiji Maharaj has said the Mahima of this Vachanamrut by saying that everyone should create this habit. Potani bhul joi. Look at your own flaws. Look at it regularly. Potani bhul joi. You should only look at your own flaws. And to the point where, Yogiji Maharaj used to say himself, "Koi mari bhul dekhane mane bahut kame." He was guru. He had mastered sadhuta, and he had won Shastriji Maharaj completely over. And imagine what Shastriji Maharaj's standard is for a sadhu, and for him to have just be overwhelmed by Yogiji Maharaj's sadhuta. And still, Yogiji Maharaj says, "Mari bhul thai ne to tamare mane keu." And he would tell the youngest sadhus this. And so I think it has to be a habit that we try to cultivate before we're faced with a scenario that's very difficult. There's some things that you have to kind of practice for. It's like when we're playing sports, how do you practice for that, moment where you're facing your opponent in the most critical time, in the most, important match or game? Well, it's in the training sessions that where nothing else is happening, like where you've practiced your swing or your grip, or the small things that matter, but in scenarios that are much more manageable, where you're not overwhelmed by the circumstances. And if you practice that enough, then it becomes second nature. I think that's what we have to do, that, and that's why Maharaj is saying it at the very beginning. Right? Look at your flaws. Just create that habit and just ingrain it into your mind that, okay, this, that if something is kind of disturbing you, then first look inside, because that's what you can fix. You can actually have control over it. Make a habit of it, because at some point you're going to be in Rajogun or Tamogun, where you won't have the ability to stop yourself, and you're going to be reliant on second nature or habitual actions. So if you've created a habit that says, okay, something's wrong, what's wrong with me? Then you have a chance to win these moments. Otherwise, I think you're right. It's so hard to win when, like Alea Khatir, you can feel sorry for him too then, because, he didn't have the benefit of this Vachanamrut probably. But at some point, Maharaj probably gave him this Updesh in other ways. But he would have to have practiced this in order to face those scenarios that caused him to get really upset and not react in the worst way.
And something you said reminded me of the Swami Vat, and a lot of times, like, you can try to like create a meme that you constantly remember something. And so I always remember like Murak Vakane Tere Raji Thai. And it's almost like a small test that if someone praises you and you like it, it's just you automatically see this word Murak.
Oh, that's awesome.
Murak. Like, it's just it's a meme in essence, but it's a form to sort of start retraining your mind that, hey, what he's saying in this Vachanamrut makes a lot of sense, because my mind doesn't normally work like that. So I have to train it in that capacity.
This is one of the great things about satsang and our gurus, where Nishkulanand Swami, Yogiji Maharaj, Bhagatji Maharaj, Shastriji Maharaj, they've created these kinds of seemingly simple statements, but there's so much wisdom in it. Right? Imagine learning something in Bal Mandir, like a Swami Vat that says ke dayo hoy tene vade tere raji thai, and murak hoy tene vakhane tere raji thai. I mean, if it's ingrained enough into you, then, as you said, I mean, you can be 40 years old, you could be 60 years old, you could be 70 years old, and you just learn to like train yourself that am I getting, overly happy about someone saying something nice about me? And the word mura comes up. It's amazing. That's one of the great things. Satsang has these sort of simple ways of imbibing deep spiritual, virtues.
All right, so further. In addition, he accepts whatever words of advice God and the Sant offer as the highest truth, but does not doubt their words at all. Thus, when the Sant tells him, you are distinct from the mind, body, indriyas, and prans, you are Satya. You are the knower of the body, indriyas, and prans, which are all asatya. He accepts this to be the truth.
So I think that here there's two different ideas that are put together in a way to help understand or appreciate the value of the first one. So the first one is about who's worthy of trust, right? Like who in this world that is in our life is the most worthy of trust, let's say. Because I think it's natural for us to use trust as a tool to actually live a normal life, and a life that allows us to focus on important things. But amongst those things, amongst all the people and all the different institutions and different objects, I guess, that we place trust in, who's most worthy of it? And someone who has this ability to see between Sat and Asat sees that, okay, I'm going to place the highest level of that trust in this Sant. And then Maharaj connects it right away just to help show what the value of that is to the idea of Atmagnan. Right. So one of the most difficult things for us is to be able to distinguish our true selves from our body and our mind, because it feels like it's intangible. And we're so used to needing things that we can hold and touch and comprehend. And now you're trying to wrestle with something that is just outside of all of those, all of those forms. Well, how can you do it? That's what Maharaj says, that, okay, if you trust the Sant, and if you place the highest level of trust in the Sant, because you see that what he says is the highest form of truth, well, the payoff is this. The payoff is you get to be able to achieve something that otherwise is not normally achievable.
So I think one of the things that you mentioned is that the highest truth. So it's not you just believe them to be true, or but he is saying, like, there's a level to it. Like, there's nothing else above this. It's the highest form of truth. And if you believe it to be the highest form of truth and you don't doubt it, then the second statement sort of falls in line. So why do you think he used the word highest? And, I think about that too, is that there's so many sources of truth or information, maybe not truth, but information. So how do we, right now, while we're trying to figure out, like, where is the true form of truth, he's saying not only truth, but the highest form of truth.
Yeah, especially now, like, everyone has their own truth.
Yeah.
And that sort of discussion is really common, that, okay, what's your truth, and relative truth, and we have all these ideas about truth. And when we talk about Sat and Asat, what we're trying to get to is something that is eternally true, that is always true. And the reason I think Maharaj is qualifying it here with that adjective, the highest truth, in Gujarati we say Param Satya. Why? Because there's a nature to it that we're not qualified to judge it. Like, there's a nature to it because it's an eternal thing, and we're so used to still operating on a worldly level, right? We operate on things that I can see. Well, there's so many things that are outside of our ability to see, the spectrum of light. There's so many things that are outside of the frequencies that we can hear. There's so many experiences that we can't really judge. And so amongst all of those things, what is the highest form of truth? well, more than likely, it's going to be something that you're not qualified to judge. Because, we don't have the spiritual experience. We don't have, the perception to be able to judge it. And so if I'm going to lean on someone to provide this, I want to lean on the Sant. And I lean on the Sant. And the Sant, I know because of his spiritual status, his connection with Bhagwan, his experience of Bhagwan, it's so real that if I'm going to lean on something that is eternally true, and let's use a more accessible term, an objective truth, something that's not relative to each person, but just objectively true and true eternally. Like it's true now and it's true anywhere else. Then I'm going to lean on the Sant. And I'm going to say, well, I'm not able to judge it because I'm not qualified to judge it. But I feel like he is the person that owns this. And if I have that faith, then this is the kind of thing that opens up to me. The idea of Atma and De being separate.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the Vachanamrut. That's just that. I see like a pattern or a building of a foundation that you don't perceive any faults in a satsangi, a sant, and God, and we talked about all those points. So you never see any faults there, and then you accept their words to be the highest form of truth. So it's that you have to first never see flaws, and we talked about how you have to retrain your brain and see all of those elements, and then you see them as the highest form of truth and not see any doubts. And then I think like the harder part, the less, the intangible part, like, oh, you are the Atma, that element that we can't perceive, that follows on a following sentence. So it builds and then tells you something that you don't perceive to be, you don't know if it's real or not. And he's explaining that if you follow this step, wise fashion, then you will believe this to be true.
Yeah. I think those first few steps are definitely sort of like, if not prerequisites, there are definitely things that kind of work in parallel to this idea. Because, I mean, how can you see flaws in Bhagwan and then say that, okay, I'm going to also think that what he says is Param Satya, or the highest truth. You definitely have those things in parallel. And so, yeah, there is a building of a foundation of our understanding. And I think what Maharaj is doing here is showing how someone who has this wisdom, this ability to distinguish between Sat and Asat, what are the patterns of his behavior that touch every aspect of his life. So you get to see firsthand that, okay, which direction should we be going in? And how can I know that I'm moving towards that? Because we all want to become Brahmrup. Like from the time we came into Satsang, we've been saying, Ke mara to akshar dhamma jau che, ke wo ek sankalp rakho che. And it's in our mind that apne Brahmrup thau che. We say it at the end of every sabha. And, Bapa has said that it's the main shlok in the Shiksha Patri, the main shlok in Satsang Diksha. Ke Brahmrup thene parabramni bhakti karvi che. So it's there. But now, if I'm going to stay on that path, well, these are the different aspects. And so when he gets to this point, I think there's a big benefit that he's giving right attached to that idea. And Bhagatji Maharaj is a good example of showing that, there are so many instances in Bhagatji Maharaj's time with Yogiji Swami where it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to continue and in some instances to do what Swami wanted him to do. It was counterintuitive because it didn't work with the way the community had set rules for behavior. It didn't make sense in, his personal health. He was doing things that are counterintuitive in multiple ways. And in all of those instances, his thinking was gunatit par maro de kurban. Like I've assigned this body, and by body we mean body and mind. I've assigned it to Swami. It's his. So he determines. And I think that's the manifestation of understanding that, okay, he represents the highest truth. So maybe if I'm, crushing this limestone and people are saying, well, you'll go blind, that's okay. Swami wants me to do it. And if Swami wants me to do it, then that's where I'm going to find my truth. I'm going to look here, and I'm not going to give into a lot of the other influences or a lot of the other people that are telling me about, okay, what's right, what's wrong, what should I do, what shouldn't I do. I'm going to lean on Swami because I see him as the representation of that, higher form of truth that I seek. Because I have that, right? As Maharaj is attaching it to this, it gives us, instant. In the Vachanamrut, Maharaj says ke Satpurush ni agna ne vishe vartu. Ej atma satta rupe varte. So if, just being committed to his agna is what helps determine whether or not we are atma satta. So that higher truth of Brahmani sthiti, that higher truth of, knowing the hu atma chu, or experiencing the hu atma chu, that's completely correlated to Bapa wants it, do it. Swami wants it, do it. And Bhagatji Maharaj helped us understand that. And I think that's what Maharaj is pointing out here. That if the Sant says that this is what's right, this is what you should be doing, then you just do it. Like Arjun didn't want to fight the war at one point. And Krishna said, look, I'm telling you, do what I tell you to do because I am your savior. And he did it. He said, Karishya Vachanam Tava. That was the beginning of his journey.
And then Maharaj says, he then behaves as the Atma, distinct from them all, but never follows the instincts of his own mind.
Again, probably on the power of the training that he's developed, right? That because he sees the Satpurush as the highest truth, he behaves as the Atma. As we said earlier, that Maharaj has said that as Satpurush ni Agna, like when we look at Agna, we often might just think of it as, okay, Satpurush says to do something and you do it. But Agna is probably one of the most fundamental sadhanas that we have. And it's something that allows us to transcend the limitations of our body and our mind. Because now, as Bhagatji Maharaj did, you're assigning your body and mind to the Satpurush. So his Agna, when it feels difficult, and when we overcome the difficulty by, giving to the Satpurush, that's the sadhana. And when you do that, this is possible, that you behave as the Atma. We think, oh, behaving as the Atma, what would that be? Am I flying around in space? Am I, what is that? Well, what it is that you're not giving into the delusions and limitations of your body and mind. You're living at a higher purpose, and that purpose in satsang is defined as the Satpurush's Agna. So his Agna, his Ruchi, and ultimately his Anuvruti. When you're operating on that level, now you're seeing him as the highest form of truth, and as a result, you're operating as the Atma. You're not operating as your body. You're not operating under the control of your body and your mind. And that's what it is.
Furthermore, such a person identifies those objects and evil company that may cause bondage or raise deficiencies in his ekantik dharma and shuns them, but he does not become bound by them.
Right, it goes back to the whole Atma Nishtha that he talked about in the sentence before. That if you develop that, then it doesn't matter what's around you or what interactions you might have or what attachments you might have. You're going to automatically shun all that stuff to see the bigger picture. Right? There's this one katha that I'd heard years ago probably, but it was like the Sant had done a pravachan on all these prasangs where Prabhu Swami Maharaj, the solution to all these like problems that people will come with them, he'd respond with this Nijatmanam Brahma Rupam. That if you understand the words of that one shlok in the Shikshapatri, and obviously in Bhagwan Swami Maharaj references it in the Siddha as well, but if you just realize what Maharaj is saying in that one shlok, that all these things become so like minute that it doesn't matter. And it's funny that this kind of Maharaj is talking about that same point in this Vachanamrut, that like all these things that the company and all that you may have, those deficiencies, like you can just shun them all because you have that understanding that I am Atma at the end of the day.
I like this idea of shunning objects that are going to cause deficiencies in your ekantik dharma. First, Sai Maharaj in a pravachan a little while back, he once said, "Okay, have we ever stopped to think that I want to become ekantik?" When I heard him say that, immediately I thought, well, okay, I can't remember when I've stopped to do that. And so that's the first thing, as we said before, that there's levels to it, right? That you first identify the flaw, then you could think about eradicating it. Similarly, you have to think, I want to be ekantik. And once you think that, then you can start the process of finding what's getting in the way. And there are classic examples. Nishkulanand Swami, one time he's walking through the, in his vichरण, and he notices that there's a farm where these marcha, these chilies, have come to harvest. And he just probably noticed them in a very, very quick way, no long-term sankalp. But he was so self-aware, and he was so committed to, okay, I have to attain, that which I've come here for. He said, okay, I'm going to punish you. And he ate so many of them that he probably never want to eat it again. And so there are examples like this. A lot of us probably know the story of Akshar, who's passed away now, but Akshar, Bapa stayed at his family's home in 1998 during his bypass recovery. And he was very young at the time. I think he was about 8 or 9 years old. And at some point, I think, one of the family members had told Swami that Akshar has a tendency to watch a little more TV than we think he should. And so when Bapa left, during the time that he had stayed there, the kids in that family had grown really attached to Swami. And Swami recognized it. And at the end, he said, "Okay, Akshar, can you do one thing? Can you stop watching TV?" And, Akshar is a regular kid who grew up here in America. But that, closeness to Swami, he recognized, okay, this is something that Swami wants. And he was able to shun it in such a way that, after that, once he was given an assignment in school after the 9/11 attacks, that he had to write a report based on what the news is covering of that event. And so because he had this niyam, instead of watching for school, he turned and faced the other way while the report was going on. And he would just listen to the report and take notes. And then he completed the assignment in that way. And so there are examples, from Nishkulanand Swami to even Maharaj, who, if you've thought about it in such a way that, okay, this is getting in the way of my real progress, my real spirituality, then I have to get rid of it. Can't have it. And it's very noble, and it's very admirable to have that kind of attitude. I think it's difficult too, but I think it's mostly difficult because we don't spend enough time thinking that I want to be granted. And so how do you even identify, okay, this is getting in the way?
And I think it's like, Maharaj later uses the word like Shatruparno towards your Swabhavs, and it's like very fitting to the prasang you mentioned about Nityananda Swami or even Akshar. Like, it's something in the way, and then you're essentially attacking it, to see it as like a cancer or something that's in your way, and so you have to put all your effort to do so. And I think otherwise you just see it as like, oh, it's actually benefiting me to have this other swabhav, and that's how we see it today, or I see it. And so you don't attack it. You just let it sit there and simmer and get bigger or get more in the way.
Yeah, and none of us want to be told. Like, none of us want to be told, hey, you need to use your phone less, or you need to get off social media. It's usually self-discovery that encourages us or inspires us to move forward.
Also, he imbibes positive thoughts and avoids negative thoughts. One who behaves in this manner should be known to possess wisdom.
Yeah, so that word wisdom comes up at the end. And I think that wisdom, the word wisdom has been used for Vivek, but that last characteristic, or let's say virtue or habit that Maharaj is talking about, is having this propensity to have a positive outlook. I don't want to just simplify it by saying optimism, because I think there's a connotation that comes with that. But you can have this perspective that, hey, what's the best part of any situation? Because then you always have a way to progress. You always have a way to move forward. Things don't always go right, and things aren't always perfect, and things aren't always the way we want. But if you've developed the habit to kind of look at, okay, what's positive? Where can I work? What strength can I lean on? Then I think, one core aspect of this and how it works really well with what Maharaj talked about in the beginning is that, okay, if you have this tendency to look at flaws, then maybe sometimes it could be overwhelming to think, oh, I have so many flaws. Mansai Maharaj always tells us that with all the flaws that we notice within ourselves, we should never forget that aparne je Bhagwan ne sant marya chhe, that they are much, much, much more powerful than any of the flaws that may seem overwhelming to us. That at the moment it might feel like, okay, I can't get over my ego. I can't get over, my propensity to get angry. But then you think about, okay, Maharaj and Swami, and they've promised me, they've accepted me, they've given me a place in Satsang, and they've accepted me as their Shishya, as is. So they must see Danu Thasin, because they don't deal with Gujarati mother, the word vyarth, right? Like, they don't deal with causes that have no value. They only do stuff that is worth their time and effort. And I've become part of that. So having that positive attitude and that positive outlook is really important, especially if we're going to try to focus on correcting the flaws that we may notice through introspection.
I think Uncle Boy mentioned that, it's just 3 short paragraphs, but packs a lot of punch. And we talked about, the highest form of self-awareness. We talked about not being delusional in a lot of different capacities, how ego drives us being able to see faults in others so easily, but not seeing it in ourselves. And then how we need to see Maharaj and Swami as the ultimate form of truth, to sort of start retraining our mind to get to that ultimate form of self-awareness. So I certainly learned a lot just sitting amongst you 3 and explaining it. So thank you.
I think it's the lesson is, I think it's just good to talk about concepts that might feel a little bit outside of our normal conversation. But sometimes just talking about it leads us to, access things that we've learned during our time in satsang, either through Kathavarta with Swami Bapa or Goshtis that we've participated in the past. But, we don't always bring it to surface. And having conversations like this helps bring those things to surface.
It's a good reinforcement.